My name is Dr. Sekou Franklin. I'm the president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, and I'm hoping that you can hear me. And I thank you for joining us for this important conversation and town hall titled "An Assault on Democracy: Fallout from the Capitol Insurrection, Impeachment, and Beyond." Our panelists today are Dr. Stephanie Williams at the University of South Florida, Dr. Nikol Alexander-Floyd at Rutgers University, and Dr. Albert Samuels at Southern University and A&M College. And our moderator is Dr. Melanie Johnson at Southern University and A&M College. And you will hear more about our panelists in a couple of minutes. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Albert Samuels for helping to organize this event. I'll make a few comments before I pass it on the event on to our moderator. NCOBPS is an organization that's been around since 1969. Our organization is rooted in intellectual rigor, scholar activism, mentorship, and also research. I want to recognize, for those individuals who are viewing this on Facebook or viewing this live in our Zoom town hall, I want to recognize our executive council. I also want to recognize our past presidents, including our executive director, Dr. Kathy Strohmile Golden, and our vice president, Dr. Tiffany Willoughby Herrard. Before moving on, I want to make sure that the audience knows that in a couple of weeks, NCOBPS will host our 52nd annual conference. It will be a virtual conference that you can access from your home, of course. And I want to give you an idea of what this conference is attempting to do. We just want to make sure I get out of this. Yeah. We're asking individuals who wanted to attend the conference to register for the conference. You can register at a very at a rate that's effectively the cheapest that NCOBPS has had in terms of conference registration. $75 for faculty, $40 for graduate students, and $25 for undergraduate students. And we do have a special grant in which we are assisting HBCU faculty and students to attend the conference. So please join us March 10th through March 13th. Register for the conference, and you will get a lot of interesting debates and intellectual rigor at the conference. Finally, what I'll say before turning it over to Dr. Johnson is that regarding this topic, the assault on democracy, NCOBPS did put out a statement, and the statement was released in early January. You can see the statement right here. I'm not going to read the entire statement, but what I will do is just read the final paragraph, and that is that NCOBPS condemns the January 6th insurrection. Our executive council approved of this statement, that we saw it as an act of domestic terrorism propagated by white supremacy, far right-wing conspiracy theories, and state-backed violence. We urge political science departments and university administrations to take an authoritative stand against racial authoritarianism, extremism, and voter suppression. We also urge the political science discipline to develop an action plan for countering mass disinformation and far right-wing conspiracy theories. So let's turn to our panel. Our moderator today is Dr. Melanie Johnson. She is an assistant professor of political science and co-activity director for Title III at Southern University and A&M College in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She teaches courses on civic engagement, political participation, office for City Council and District 2 in Baton Rouge. She has several years of experience in higher education, grant compliance, grant writing, and workforce development. She's a graduate of Southern University and A&M College and earned her PhD from Louisiana State University. She's a strong advocate for empowering students and also the underserved and unrepresented populations. She's our moderator, so I will turn it over to her. Then I'm going to take a step back and work the logistics in the background. Thank you. Dr. Johnson.
Unmute yourself.
No one can hear you.
Either unmute yourself.
Dr. Johnson, unmute yourself. See if I can.
See if I can text her.
Dr. Johnson.
Sorry about that. Yes, I'm here. Sorry about that. I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Franklin. I'm sorry about the technical difficulty. That's the way to start. But thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to welcome everyone here today for this town hall meeting to discuss this very important topic. I have the distinct pleasure this evening of introducing our panelists. And I will start off with Dr. Nikol Alexander-Floyd. She is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University, and she's also a lawyer. As a legal theorist and activist, she has produced scholarship and provided commentary on some of the cutting-edge legal cases of our time, including the important Hopwood case in Texas. Her involvement in leadership around Hopwood led to guest appearances and interviews on the Oprah Winfrey Show and on National Public Radio. Welcome, Dr. Alexander-Floyd. Dr. Stephanie Williams, she's a political scientist who specializes in American conservatism and race from massive resistance in the 1950s to the Trump era. Her research includes the Southern strategy, Reaganism, and rationalized rhetoric related to the social safety net of Democratic and Republican presidents from 1964. She earned her PhD in government from the University of South Florida and her MA from George Washington University and her undergraduate degree from Spelman College in Atlanta. Welcome, Dr. Stephanie Williams. And last but not least, Dr. Albert Samuels, who is the Jewel Lamar Prestige Kellogg Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Political Science and History Department at Southern University and A&M College. In addition to publishing several articles, Dr. Samuels is the author of Is Separate Unequal? Black Colleges and the Challenge to Desegregation. He also serves as a political analyst for local radio and television stations. His quotes have appeared, in the Washington Post, the USA Today, the US News and World Report, the Morning Advocate, and several other publications. Welcome, Dr. Albert Samuels. Panelists, you will be given 7 minutes. Then after that, we will have a Q&A session. I ask that everyone put their questions in the chat, and we will try to answer them as timely as we can. So without further ado, I turn this over to the panelists.
Dr. Floyd.
Good evening, everyone. I want to begin first by thanking our president, Dr. Sekou Franklin, who is, if not the, certainly one of the most, the hardest working folks, political scientists in the profession right now, who's done a stellar job leading our organization. Thank you so much for your leadership and for coordinating things this evening. And to Dr. Samuels and Dr. Williams, I've so enjoyed speaking with you about this and glad that we were able to join a broader audience. I'm going to time myself as well so I can make sure that we stay on point. I want to focus for a brief period of time on one particular dynamic that I think is important to understanding this political moment, and also the type of leadership that, and I put that in scare quotes, that we have seen, the type of machinations that we have seen with the former President Donald Trump and mainline Republicans especially. And so as I tweeted earlier today, in terms of what sadomasochism or S&M has to do with the 2021 insurrection and impeachment. That was not a typo. I actually didn't mean that. But we're going to talk about that for just a moment. And so that's the key question again. How can sadomasochism as an analytic understand contemporary politics, including the authoritarian leadership of Trump and the 2021 insurrection and impeachment? In my forthcoming book, Reimagining Black Women, a critique of post-feminist and post-racial melodrama in culture and politics, take up the question of sadomasochism as an analytic in terms of what happens in workplaces and also within. And so I wanted to think through this particular analytic in terms of what we see. As we know, fascism is a political philosophy and mode of governance marked by extreme nationalism, racial hierarchy, and the centralization of governmental authority. I have spent time really revisiting the Frankfurt School of Critical Social Theory and have found particularly useful work by Adorno and Erich Fromm. Adorno, of course, talked about the ways in which in fascist societies, people focus on idealizing leaders, authoritarian leaders, and also have an unhealthy form of identification. Our identification, we know, can be a normal process of human development in many regards, but when identification takes place such that individuals actually begin to see themselves in a type of merger with particular leaders or figures, become one with them, this is a problem, and it's part of what we see as an identifying feature of fascist politics. Also, Adorno draws our attention to the ways in which authoritarian leaders are both seen as supermen or a Superman figure, great or strong man in some people's formulations, and at the same time, paradoxically, also seen as a common person or everyman. We can definitely see those dynamics at work in terms of Donald Trump. Erich Fromm, and this is where I want to kind of land very briefly, deals with the question not only of political and social and economic forces, but also how those are tied into ideas about wounded masculinity. And he deals with Germany, of course, post-World War I. One of the key ideas that many people offered to explain the rise of fascism was a popular narrative about Germany being emasculated, about the penalties for World War I being so severe that they left the population ripe for fascism and thinking about a sense of woundedness, and also the sadomasochistic dynamic, so that people actually come to submit masochistically to authoritarian leadership. Of course, Fromm and Adorno both go into these concepts in greater detail. But part of what I try to examine in this larger work, and also in terms of what's happening with Trump, is what's referred to as a transnational business masculinity. And I expand on the work of others who have dealt with this particular concept, right? People who are typically heads of key global organizations, major corporations or governmental entities. They, in addition to having a circulation and power, have a particular type of understanding of themselves in terms of gender power. And so unfettered access to women's bodies, especially women of color, and also unfettered access and domination of labor. And I add a kind of authoritarian and sadomasochistic style in terms of leadership strategies. I look at Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the former head of IMF in this regard, and also Donald Trump, I think, is a prime example of what this transnational business masculinity looks like. And so this is something that needs to remain on our radar as we understand what's happening. Now, and I'll just go back here. So part of what I pull from the work of Lynn Chancer in terms of sadomasochism in everyday life to understand what's happening. And she essentially looks at 4 dynamics, right? Excessive attachment or dependency of the sadist and masochist, relations that are sedimented in terms of repetitive and ritualistic activities, the development of a dynamic mode of relating that can potentially reverse positionalities. That's not something that I focus on, but most importantly, significant fallout for the masochist for resisting the sadist position or power. So what we saw in terms of the incitement that happened on January 6th was a kind of real-time operation of this sadomasochistic dynamic. We can see it in terms of the response, in terms of throughout Trump's presidency. And also, and I'll end with this so I can make sure I end on time, we can speak about this more in the Q&A, it helps to explain the way in which people within the Republican Party bow down to Trump and understand themselves in terms of relating to him. Of course, I am not arguing that, for instance, they do not adhere to some of the more problematic white nationalist ideas that are associated with Donald Trump, not by far. But part of what defines this leadership style is sadomasochism as a political dynamic, and I'll end there.
Thank you, Dr. Floyd. Dr. Samuels, would you like to go next?
Okay. Thanks a lot here. Let me, I want to, first of all, let me see if I can share, screen. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, in the words of Mark Twain. I predicted when Donald Trump was elected that the Donald Trump presidency would be the political scientist full employment act. And I think that has pretty much borne out throughout his administration. And here we are, after he is out of office, talking about him and his impact. Probably one of the most commonly used modifier for describing the Trump presidency has been how unprecedented it is in so many ways. And I don't have time to go into some of the various ways in which this presidency has been viewed as unprecedented, from the tweets to the nepotism to the curious relationship with Russia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's one of the most common descriptive terms that we have used to describe his presidency. But of all of these, the blatant assault on the principle of free and fair elections, which culminated with on January the 6th with the Capitol insurrection, really stands out in this category of the unprecedented. So as a result of all of that, Donald Trump would then become the first president in the history of this country to actually be impeached twice. So yes, unprecedented is a common metaphor that's been used to describe the Trump presidency. But the question I want to raise is how, at a certain level, how unprecedented was this really? I mean, after all, this isn't the first time that we've had folks to not accept the results of a democratic election. The Civil War essentially started because the South refused to accept the legitimacy of a democratic election. We talk a whole lot about how divided this country is, that there's this so-called unprecedented division in the country, and yet, what was the Civil War but division? Division, you know. So there are perhaps some dangerous parallels between some of the divides that we see between Red America and Blue America. Of course, race and racism is at the heart of these schisms. In the case of the Civil War, of course, it was the South basically seceded from the Union in order to protect the institution of slavery. The election of Abraham Lincoln, the election of the first president from a party that was actually on his platform was dedicated to preventing the expansion of slavery. That was the last straw for the South. And certainly when it comes to what's happening with Donald Trump, certainly white resentment is at the core of that. Donald Trump basically represents the America's reaction to the election of the first African-American president. Without Barack Obama, there is no Donald Trump. And so race, once again, is at the core of that division. Which then leads to this, and that is, I think I call this because the title of this presentation was really the unremarkable nature of white political violence. And the historic dynamic in this country has always been that in response to Black advancement, the instinctive response of America has been white rage, and white rage manifested in violence. This is a predictable result, and in this case, the role that African Americans played in key localities like Atlanta, like Philadelphia, like Detroit, like Milwaukee, in swinging the election to Joe Biden and taking away from some white Americans their champion, the person who was restoring America, who was making America great again. But this is a dynamic that we have seen repeatedly over and over in American history, whether it was the end of the Civil War, after Reconstruction, whether it's the veterans coming back from World War I and World War II, whether it's Black people trying to move into white people's neighborhoods, the Civil Rights Movement, the explosion of hate groups after the election of the first African-American president. There has been this predictable surgence of white rage manifested in political violence. Anytime there's a perception that African Americans and other minority groups are gaining, quote unquote, too much power. And we're coming for you too. It's the really, I'm thinking about when Donald Trump Jr. Hit this speech on January the 6th, in which he was, of course, his words were actually directed at Republicans in Congress, and many of them who saying we're not doing enough to help them steal the election. But this idea of political violence historically has not always directed simply at Blacks. It is also directed at whites also, who are not deemed to be sufficiently committed to the principle of white supremacy. supremacy. This is the image from the coup d'etat that occurred in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where a white mob overthrows a democratically elected government, elected by a biracial coalition of Republicans and populists. Literally in the white Declaration of Independence that accompanies this, whites express their determination not only to never again be ruled by Negroes, but also the conviction that whites who would collaborate with Blacks, they can also be justly disenfranchised. And so this idea of we're coming for you too is a shout, is an echo that has spring throughout American history. It's not just directed at Black people, but also directed at white people who would dare to ally with Black people in the effort to overturn white supremacy. Yet, in spite of all this history, somehow America was surprised by all of this because of the basic denial of the facts about American history, this city on the hill image that the country has about itself, and the willful ignoring of the signs and the evidence of the creeping authoritarianism and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're constantly hear America say, well, this is not who we are. But the Capitol insurrection and the mob that descended upon them, look like a lynch mob. That is the America that Black people know very well. Now it shocked white people, but that's the America that Black people are all too familiar with. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Samuels. I have, last but not least, Dr. Williams, your comments.
Good evening. My discussion really ties well with Dr. Samuels. So I'll start. Masses Resistant 2.0, Congress has returned to the Southern Manifesto in response to the Biden electoral victory. Donald Trump's coup attempt is forcing a re-examination of the Republican Party's long legacy of disenfranchising people of color. While the violence of Trump supporters used to overtake the Capitol have remained in the public's focus, it's essential that the actions of the 8 Republican senators and 139 representatives who refused to certify the Electoral College votes are placed in the proper context of American history. This act of defiance resembles the Southern Manifesto of 1956, in which 19 senators and 82 representatives submitted a letter to Congress to state their refusal to recognize the Brown versus Board of Education decision to desegregate public schools. Although that insurrection did not include a violent invasion of Congress or use violence against members of Congress and Capitol Police, it was still an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of our democracy. The argument that the Southern Manifesto made was that the Supreme Court did not have the legitimate right to decide to desegregate American schools was critical to the foundation of today's and the development of today's Republican Party. The letter and communications that Congress members sent to justify their objection to the certification of the 2020 election are serving the same purpose to justify the removal and the delegitimization of people of color's right to vote. These members falsely asserted that President-elect Biden's victory was only possible due to massive fraud in the states of Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and Black and Latino voters provided overwhelming support to Biden. They based their position that massive fraud formed the basis for Biden's win, even though secretaries of states in both parties and 61 federal decisions were made that concluded that no such fraud existed. These actions and assertions show the Republican Party views the Democratic Party and its multicultural electoral base as fundamentally illegitimate, and therefore they have no moral authority to respect the will of the voters. while Trump's actions leading to the insurrection encouraged many people to believe that this event was uniquely linked to Trump. These events surrounding the insurrection demonstrate that the Southern Manifesto of 1956 has made a full circle return to Congress in 2021. Segregationist refusal to accept the legitimacy of Brown is part of their actions to grant legitimacy to political decisions to eliminate political power whenever possible when it is against the Republican Party. The current objections raised regarding the electoral count should not be viewed as a one-time political stunt. Racial conservatives have used Congress to perpetuate unfounded accusations of non-white have intentionally defrauded multiple institutions for electoral wins, as well as defrauding the national treasury. For decades, Republicans from Newt Gingrich through Strom Thurmond and other party leaders through the Tea Party movement have told their followers that Black people of color and the people of color are stealing from them. They should not be surprised that insurrectionists justify the coup as an attempt based to legitimize their votes, their inability to convince the majority of Americans to vote for Republican values and Trump values. Today's Republican Party may distance themselves from the past, and some of the signers of some say the majority of the signers of the Southern Manifesto were Southern Democrats, and this does not apply to today's GOP. However, an ahistorical response is unacceptable. It's time for the former Republicans who opposed Trump but benefited from previous efforts to build their party on the false premise that Blacks and other non-whites have stolen their American privileges to own up to what they have created over the past decades that led up to the insurrection. Every party platform since the Southern Manifesto that the Republican Party has developed was based on the view of a stolen America. This is the foundation of the Southern strategy. To be fair, there are some who have written that they were part of a party who perpetuated this narrative. One of the most prolific GOP strategists, Stuart Stevens, wrote a book in 2020 stating this fact. Stevens is far and few between. Many of the Never Trumpers have not owned up to the past. And due to the success of the Black women in Georgia and in Alabama in the 2018 and 2020 elections, a lot of the effort a lot of the responsibility of who should restore voters and correct voter fraud has been placed on Black women and coalitions of multicultural voters who have found a common link in rolling back Trumpism. But we know there are several senior members of the GOP who have, since Reagan's era in the 60s, who are many still alive, and those who still have used voter suppression tactics and racial rhetoric to deny fair access to the vote, gave aid and comfort to Republicans up until 2016, when they had a candidate who they found objectionable, but still in many ways shared the values that they had regarding minorities. And so it's time to ask where they are in rectifying the problem of Trumpism, and what are they doing to not just place the burden on people of color to correct the voting suppression and the rhetoric that it basically criminalizes the ability of people of color to engage in elections. These include former governors, many of who should be concerned about what's happening in states such as Michigan, due to the military militia coming to threaten elected officials and Republican officials across the United States. And also people such as Liz Cheney, who warned the GOP that white supremacy, that the GOP is coming a white supremacy party. Otherwise, please spare us the lamentations that the party of Lincoln is becoming the white supremacy party.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and thank you, panelists, for your powerful, thought-provoking presentations. Now we will open the floor up for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Johnson, for being such a great moderator this evening. I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge the passing recently of one of our own, Dr. Keith Jennings. Many of us, were blessed to know him in different ways. He was someone who was a steadfast fighter for freedom, not only here, but abroad, particularly in Africa. I was acquainted with him in particular with regard to his work with Amnesty International. When I was a graduate student, he gave me encouragement as I was finishing my dissertation when it was sorely needed. He was as kind and generous as he was steadfast and sharp. And I think it's appropriate to lift up his legacy, because his commitment to using his skills and his knowledge to actually organize and to build institutions and to support other people in doing so is the kind of thing that we will need to carry us through this moment.
Thank you. We do have one question, and I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but his first name is Tony. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce. I will not try to pronounce your last name. I know I will say it incorrectly. But his question is, I'm sorry?
No, I can answer it. You can read it.
What is it? Okay. Oh, no, go ahead. You can answer it.
So Tony's question asks about, there were a minuscule number of Black people and Latinx men who took part in the insurrection. And I did have a conversation last week with Mike Madrid. As Tony may know, that's someone, he's worked in Republican politics, mostly in California, in the West, and Republican Latino politics. His assessment was that there are a group of, a very small group of Black and Latino men who have a very angry view of the being constantly left out of the economy, and that they are also willing to engage in a toxic masculinity that is in this group of men who are there. There are a number of the Proud Boys who are multicultural, that they have some Latino and some Black members. Now, they were just one group. Some of the other groups were absolutely white supremacy groups. But it was his assessment, and he's a Republican, that Democrats don't do much for working class men, Latino or Black men, and so that that they found an opening in the Trump movement. So I agree with some of it, but to be in such a anti, Black or Latino space with some of those other men with carrying the Confederate flag, I'm sure there's a cognitive dissonance with that as well.
I would like to weigh in as well on that. I agree with what Professor Williams has said, and I also think, and maybe I saw Tamlin Tucker works on earlier. It may be a place for her to comment should she like. I think because she specializes in thinking about the Black church and particularly mega churches. I believe that part of what is important is to think about the impact of Christian nationalism in a variety of denominations. It is especially important to think about it in terms of what I call charismania, charismatic movement that's attached to the name it and claim it segment. It's where Paula White is most known for. And I just want to lift up briefly, I know there are a lot of questions and other people who want to comment. Some of you have heard of Bryson Gray, who is the Black rapper who, and this is a real story, this is not an SNL skit. His album was called MAGA Ain't Got No Color. And one of his songs, You Can Leave 45, MAGA Boy, pro-life, pro-God, pro-Trump, save the babies. He also has a line in there, again, that ties in with ideas about masculinity, bravado, strong men. But he talks about manly face, manly shoulders, bigger hands than Trump, in fact. Don't you question gender. Gender's infinite. They'll tell you that. So I think that it's we could probably tease out different strands of influence that explain this. And I'll just say one last thing. It would be interesting to also think about this in terms of the work that Cheryl Lynn and Ishmael White have done in Steadfast Democrats, because they talk about social issues of social constraint, and that part of what explains Black partisanship are norms that are enforced within Black communities and organizations and families, and they try to think through what happens when those particular social constraints are not there. And so I'll just end with that.
Excellent.
Thank you. Dr. Samuels, I actually have a question specifically for you, but I didn't know, were you about to make a comment?
No, just ask the question.
Okay, so the question is, someone's wondering, given the factors that you focused on in your presentation, on how you've historicized the process, how do you think U.S. participation in its two longest wars in its history impacts what you correctly observe in a white violent response?
Well, I think that probably one way of looking at this, you're right, these are the two longest wars that we have waged. And what's, I think one thing that's noteworthy about not just about the war in Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan, is that we haven't had a war with really a white nation since 1945. And so in some ways, on the international stage, you think about all of the military engagements that the United States has been involved in, not just the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but excursions in Guatemala, the toppling of governments in Chile, the undermining of the democratic regime in Iran. they have been with non-white peoples. And so in some ways, this is a continuation of, or an externalizing of the typical political military violence against non-white peoples.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Samuels. Another question for the panelists is, in order to fight the current surge and breed of white nationalists and extremist groups, are there enough democratic norms, policies, and laws in place to be successful, or are there new measures that need to be taken?
I'd like to answer that. I think one of the when I was talking to Mike Madrid last week, he's basically convinced that yes, there is voter suppression, but there's not that much that voter suppression that makes a difference in elections, and people wouldn't intentionally engage in that, and because the return is so little. And, I completely disagreed with him on that. And we were just going to have to drop that. But I think that a lot of people, especially a lot of white people, finally understood that voter suppression applies to them if they can throw out a whole state. And the misinformation regarding voter suppression or the lack of including white people in the discussion regarding voter suppression, as if this can happen to you, so when them seeing themselves in lines in Atlanta for 8 hours or 9 hours, that is voter suppression. Your ballots being sent back because you didn't sign the naked ballot is voter suppression. So it has to be a public education. This is just not a people of color issue. This is an American voter issue. And the misinformation that goes with it is really a big problem before we can, I believe, change policy. Dr. Samuels, you were nodding your head a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I say amen to all of that. And just real quickly, I mean, the common theme throughout a lot of what you were saying in his responses is that it's not a problem for him because it doesn't happen to him. Right. And that's the beauty of how racism has always worked in this country. Racism works because it's designed to shield white people from the actual consequences of what racism daily visits to Black people. And so it's not real until it happens to them. When we talk about it, you're being too sensitive, that's not what you saw. It's only when it happens to them that it matters.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's the point with, with you, we had some of these Republicans saying, well, what's what can we do about it? It's like, well, you can go back to your state and stop suppressing the vote. That's what you can do about it, because we're in this situation because the electorate got small in 2016 and we're paying the consequence of it. So, it's them who need to be fixing this problem with us as well, not just Stacey Abrams, although, I love her as but this is their problem as well.
I don't know if we have one. See, we're running close on our time here. Someone in the chat asked a couple of questions, particularly in terms of capitalism, right? Which we only had 7 minutes trying to seed issues for a broad discussion. But when I discuss transnational business masculinity, part of what goes along with that, right, in terms of a politics that seeks access, unfettered access to the domination of labor globally, right? And so that's part of what goes along with neoliberalism in this moment. One of the things that Christian Parenti argues that Trump was able to do successfully, amid the different themes that he talked about in his speeches for 2016 election, he did have pay some attention to thinking about questions about job loss, what's happening economically. Of course, we know this is also couched in the same context where he's actually absolutely pro Wall Street. But this particular narrative hook is part of a constellation of ideas that Trump utilized to actually to gain support. What we see in this moment, a dire need to really sharpen analysis that thinks through major policy shifts. I will say that the idea of having a honeymoon for elected officials needs to be thrown into a waste bin. That concept comes from, at least according to one historian, from the practice of actually bride capture. So we can let it go. We need to actually be very vigilant in terms of thinking about a politics that does not focus on optics and one that does focus on outcomes and policy, and that includes but also exceeds an electoral horizon, right? And so in that vein, I have been very encouraged by especially the renewed labor organizing that is happening, and many of the people who are leading the charge, whether it be in education or at Amazon, are actually people of color, and especially Black women.
Okay. I think that concludes. We have, before I say thank you to all the panelists, we had a question that came through our Gmail system. So I want to make sure I ask that question. And the question is, despite the painful part of the Trump presidency, the question was, and I want to make sure I say this the right way. The question is, did the Trump presidency expose how things haven't changed over time and the deficiencies in our Constitution? And perhaps the Trump presidency, though painful, was useful in doing that. And that was a question that came through our Gmail system about 30 minutes ago.
Yeah, and I started to respond. I think what the problem that it exposed was that the Constitution assumed that you have a Congress that would have a check on an unfettered president. It did not assume that the Congress would be participating in the coup as well. And I think it also made us understand why our electoral college is a hindrance to us. I mean, the fact that Biden won by almost 7.5 million votes, that we really had this fight over manipulating the electoral college means that we don't need to have this electoral college. Many people told them this, but we really don't need it now because we need to have a majority voting system democracy.
Okay.
We need to fight for that.
And just as a piggyback, the last question before we close, that Dr. Lusane posed real quick, are there any other new measures that should be proposed to introduce more democratic norms into the process?
I think that probably we're going to have a lot of discussion on how we vote and whether we should have a unified a federal election system instead of 50 different states. Yeah, I think that would take a lot of pressure off of the ability to defraud the system. And when I say defraud the system, I'm talking about the state legislatures defrauding the voters of the system.
It could also be an easy target.
Yeah.
Well, there's a bill right now that would do precisely the things, a lot of the things that what you described. I was gonna say just real quickly, and I'm gonna stop. I think probably the useful thing about the Trump presidency is that it just simply revealed what America is. America believes that it's an exceptional nation, that we're not like Europe. We don't have a reactionary tradition, anything like this. We actually do. America has an ancient regime, is white, capitalist, patriarchy. That's why, and so the reaction of the coming about Donald Trump comes about because of the reaction to Barack Obama, and that's part of a cycle. That wasn't a one-off. There's a constant reactionary tradition. Whenever Black people or the others appear to be gaining too much power, there's a predictable reaction. That is not a one-off, it is a tradition. That's how American politics is. And so we need to accept that's how it is before we can fix it.
Yep.
On that note, we'd like to thank the panelists, and I'll just say briefly that I want to thank NCOBPS for sponsoring this panel, and the Assault on Democracy is an apt title, and what occurred on January 6th, if you look at what's happened afterwards and look at what the state legislatures are doing in many states, it's a quite brutal assault on democracy. The policies that states are advancing are so horrible and so authoritarian that we're really going to need NCOBPS members and political scientists to join forces with activists and organizers to try to figure out this authoritarian regime that's taking place in all these states. So I want to thank the panelists, Dr. Melanie Johnson, for moderating the panel, Dr. Nikol Alexander-Floyd, Dr. Stephanie Williams, and Dr. Albert Samuels, who's really the brainchild of this town hall. Thanks to all the people who attended this town hall. Thanks for the questions and Q&As and for pushing us to be more prophetic in our answers and our commentaries. And also, as a reminder, our national conference takes place March 10th through 13th. It's not too late to register for the conference. Make sure you let your students know about it. Students can get in for $25. If you're HBCU students, we have scholarships available for them to attend as well for HBCU students and faculty. And again, we want to thank the panelists for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody.
Good night.